My MakerBot Replicator has replicated. We take an in-depth look at the brand new Replicator Plus. So welcome to ZDNet's DIY IT 3D Printing Discovery Series. My name is David Gewirtz, and we're going to have some fun with these two printers. The Replicator 5th generation is roughly 2.5 years old, and in desktop 3D printing terms, that's pretty ancient. Now, they've just introduced an entirely brand new, or mostly brand new machine called Replicator Plus, and we're going to go into that. We'll look at the Replicator Plus and the 5th generation and see how they work together. I want to point out something that might be a little bit confusing. The new product is here on your left, and the older product is on your right. That's because this has been sitting here and installed and been working for the past year or so, and when I got the newer product, I didn't want to take the older one out. I wanted to just add it and do all my testing. So when I talk about the Replicator Plus, that's the newer product, and it's over here on your left. So first we're going to do a hardware once-over, then we're going to discuss the new software, then we're going to look at performance issues, and then I am going to take you through to my conclusion. There'll be some surprises, so make sure you watch the whole thing. So let's do a hardware overview. As you can see on the surface, the frame of these two devices is virtually identical. Externally, they look the same, but there are some very substantial differences internally. For example, the build plates are different, both in size and in construction. This is the new plate. This is the old plate. The printer now has automatic bed leveling. This is kind of important because many new printers do, and the fiddly stuff trying to make sure this thing is level can be a real pain. The only weirdness about the Replicator Plus and its bed leveling is that the filament has to come out before to level the bed. So you're taking the filament out, you're leveling the bed to make sure everything is perfectly aligned, and then you're kind of pushing things back to get it to start up again. And that could be kind of an issue. It also means that you're not going to bed level between each print, you're going to bed level once in a while. But even so, it's a whole lot less fussy than having to bed level by hand by controlling these little knobs that are underneath the printer. The Replicator Plus's build area is substantially bigger. You can really see it with this tray that I originally built on the 5th generation and how it compares on the Replicator Plus. When I built it on the 5th generation, we were at just about maximum capacity, but on the Replicator Plus, there's a lot of spare area left over. You can see the size difference when you look at objects that can fit on the build plate as well. On the old build plate, you could fit 2 castles and a Yoda across the top of the plate. But on the new build plate, you can add another Yoda across the width of the plate. So if you want to think about it this way, the new build plate is 1 Yoda wider. The build plate on the Replicator Plus is different in a different way. It twists. Let's see if you can see that. It twists. And that allows plastic objects to pop off of the build plate. So let's look at removing an object from the original 5th generation build plate, which is basically made of glass with blue tape on top. Now I gotta tell you as an aside, adding and removing the blue tape is a pain. It is absolutely not one of my favorite aspects of 3D printing, but it's okay. The new build tray does not require the blue tape, so that's a big win. Anyway, removing an object is a bit of a project because you're prying the thing up, and then eventually it does come off, and you do get a clean raft. And so that raft comes off easily, and you get a clean bottom. Now, as I showed you before, this build plate is flexible. You're supposed to be able to bend it so that you can remove objects easily. I'm not fully comfortable with it because I'm afraid I'm going to break it, but we've seen that technology in a number of different 3D printers, and this thing is supposed to be able to withstand schools, so I'm guessing it's pretty strong. Now, the raft proved to be a real problem on my prints. I'll show you this later, but I think it's easily fixed in software, but at least at the moment, raft removal was difficult. I also attempted to print this thing without a raft, and as I'll show you later on, you'll see the kind of mess it made in attempting to print an object without a raft on the thing. So in addition to the new build plate, The gantry system has been reinforced. The old gantry system was based on folded sheet steel, and as you can see, the new gantry is more robust, which should allow for more stable end-to-end movement, which is why there's a larger build area from side to side. Because it's more stable and it doesn't shake as it gets to each end, and so as a result, you can have a wider build area. So networking with a built-in hotspot is built into the new Replicator Plus. The Replicator Plus is also tuned to work with a smartphone application, and so although these control panels are identical between the two machines, the new version is specifically designed to work with a smartphone to control everything from filament removal to bed heating and so forth. I had some problems initially when I tried to set this thing up. When I tried to set it up initially, I found that my wired Ethernet connection, and in this garage, I'm quite a distance from my hotspot, so I have a wired Ethernet connection that comes in here, and I found that I wasn't able to get the wired Ethernet connection to initially work with the Replicator Plus. But once I did a firmware update over Wi-Fi, it worked, and it's now working nice and solidly. So I mentioned earlier this year that the MakerBot folks had introduced the Smart Extruder Plus. This is also included with the new machine, but what this means is that the filament types haven't changed because this extruder is designed specifically for PLA. Now that's in many cases really good because ABS is kind of toxic. When I print ABS in this garage, it gets really nasty in here, and when it's very, very hot in the summer, I don't want to open the garage door. So it becomes really almost a toxic space, and so I try to print PLA more simply because it's a much more pleasant thing to work with. PLA is also a really good all-around filament, and MakerBot has said that they're introducing a new tough PLA, which is apparently much stronger, and I'll get that in here and I'll test it, and we'll look at what that can do. That's really intriguing because if they're going to be introducing that, they might introduce other PLA formats as well, and that could expand the use of this printer quite a bit. So that's the hardware. Let's take a quick visit with the new software, which has got some pluses and minuses, and then we'll move on to do performance testing. So let's talk briefly about the software or the slicer that's used to drive these two printers. This used a piece of software called MakerBot Desktop, and this now uses a piece of software called MakerBot Print. There are some substantial benefits to MakerBot Print in terms of visualizing the slicing of your model. The slicing capability in the MakerBot Desktop, while it sliced very well, the visualization was, as you can see, not so great. But there is a substantial challenge with regard to the MakerBot Replicator Plus in that the settings are relatively limited. So let's go to the desktop and let me show you what I mean. So this is MakerBot Desktop. This is the old version of software that goes with the Replicator 5th generation. And as you can see, the visualization of the slicing of the object is really crude. And the problem with that is you often need to see exactly what the structure is that you're building so you can solve problems in the 3D print production when you send it to the printer. Now take a look by contrast at the MakerBot Print software, and as you can see, it has a much higher quality. First off, its color, and secondly, there's a much higher quality in terms of what you can see, and you can also differentiate areas that are support versus the model material versus what layer you're working on and so forth. So this is a very substantial improvement over the older MakerBot Desktop and is something that was definitely overdue, and I'm glad to see. So let's take a minute and look at the settings that came with the old MakerBot Desktop, in particular the customization settings. As you can see, there's a lot of options here, from the settings on the device and extruder temperatures to print speeds at different areas for rafts and raft bases and so forth, to the types of infill and the density, to the various properties of the model, to, again, the customization of the raft, which would solve the rafting problem I've talked about, to detail options for support and bridging, and of course how you can use the extruder and some capabilities for that. So now let's take a look at the new MakerBot Print. This is the settings that you have on the MakerBot Print, and basically you can set the layer height, you can determine the number of shells, you can set your infill, and you can turn on and off supports and rafts. And that is it. There is no other customization available. There are a few options in the software itself for how you view the software, but there is nothing else in terms of customization whatsoever in terms of the new MakerBot print, and this is going to be an interesting problem as we move forward. Now, I don't consider this a deal breaker because this is a software issue, and I am reasonably sure we'll see this fixed sometime soon. In addition, there's a pretty good chance that Simplify 3D will support the Replicator Plus and give you all the sorts of capabilities you would normally need in a highly flexible slicer. But for the moment, it is a concern, and it is something I will be watching and following up with. So let's move on to performance. All right, so let's talk about performance and testing of these two printers. What I wanted to do is I wanted to see when they're put to the test using their defaults, how do they perform? What's the quality of the models? How do they do with supports? How do they do with overhangs? How well do they actually do the job they're supposed to do, which is produce 3D prints? To do this, I decided to use two different models for torture testing. I used this Castle model, which as I will show you, has all sorts of interesting advantages in terms of testing its performance. And then I also use this Yoda model, and as you might imagine, things like the Yoda ears are a bit of a challenge to print, and so we'll see how those come out. I want to do a shout out to Joel Telling, who has the YouTube channel 3D Printing Nerd, for suggesting the Castle, and I've also included a link to his video that shows all the details of why this Castle is so useful for performance testing. And I also want to do a shout out to Angus Devison, who runs the Maker's Muse YouTube channel, because he suggested the Yoda, and I'm also going to include a link so that you can watch that video and you can see why he chose this as one of his performance testing models. And just before we dive in, I want to say one last thing, and that's that I'm using, in many cases, a 10 times magnification to look at these models. So we're going to get real up close and personal with these two models. And with that, let's dive into some details. As we look at our performance test, what we want to do is go through a number of different characteristics. Let's start with print speed. MakerBot claimed that the new Replicator Plus is approximately 30% faster than the Replicator 5th generation. This proved to be a little bit of a challenge to measure because they default the Replicator Plus to a 0.2 millimeter layer height, where they default the Replicator 5th generation to a 0.1 millimeter layer height. So in other words, each layer is twice as fat when they print it in the Replicator Plus. Now you can change that. It's one of the few settings in the Replicator Plus that you can in fact change. But as you can see with this print, the print that's on the right hand side is the Replicator 5th generation, and that looks to be going a lot slower than the print on the left hand side, which is the Replicator Plus, but that's because it's printing at a much higher resolution. It's printing at twice the resolution. Net, it turns out that I did 3 separate prints, and the average was an 11% faster speed across all 3 prints. So I can't really guarantee that you're going to see anything resembling a 30% faster speed, but it is interesting that the lower resolution is the standard default for the MakerBot Replicator Plus. I don't see any reason why it can't do a 0.1 millimeter layer height, but they're definitely getting faster prints because they're going essentially a lower resolution print as a default. So now let's talk about raft removal, and this was the key problem I found with this printer, and again, it's something that should be easily fixed in software because the raft is a function of your G-code and how you set up your printer and how you set up things like supports and rafts and the thickness of the plastic and the geometry of the plastic and so forth. But I found that the raft removal on the bottom of the prints on the Replicator Plus was essentially a non-starter. As you can see, the bottom after doing a raft removal was really messy. It's not particularly nice as compared to the old 5th generation raft, which is nice and clean. So I also thought, well, maybe this new print surface doesn't require a raft, and I went ahead and I printed it without a raft. And as you can see, this glop mess is kind of what happened. I looked at the monitor and all of a sudden saw that the 3D object was moving around with the print head, which is never something you're supposed to see, and that's because the glop was building up at the end. So now let's take a look at the tower, and as you can see, we're going to take a look first at the Replicator 5th generation, and then we're going to take a look at the Replicator Plus. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a resolution difference when you're not looking at it at 10x magnification. Once you start looking at a 10x magnification, you can see quite a bit of differences, but you'll also notice that some things perform better on the Replicator 5th generation and some things perform better on the Replicator Plus. Let's first look at the rails. These rails are on the Replicator 5th generation, the older Replicator, and as you can see, they did not render particularly well. They got all kind of gobbledygooked up, whereas the rails on the tower on the new Replicator Plus came out nice and clean. The walls are similar. The walls came out pretty well on both. But what I found really interesting is when you look at the arch, which is a bridging thing, and I've done a lot of bridges with the MakerBot, it has a problem bridging with the Replicator Plus, where it doesn't appear to have a problem bridging with the Replicator 5th generation. And I think the reason for that may be that the bridge is thicker, so each strand is a heavier strand and weighs down more. And so if you go back to a 0.1 layer height, we might not see that bridging problem. The stairs are kind of interesting as well. You can see the stairs and the gate. And on the Replicator 5th generation, you can see how that turned out. And then again, you can see how it turned out on the Replicator Plus, which is a little bit cleaner. And then when we go up to the parapet walls, what you're really noticing here on the Replicator 5th generation versus on the Replicator Plus is the quality of the resolution of the print, which when you step back from it, when you're not looking at it at a 10 times magnification, you don't notice the stratifications as much. But when you are looking at it under essentially a low-powered microscope zoom, then you definitely do notice the stratifications. So let's move on to Yoda. As you can see, going from the Replicator 5th generation Yoda to the Yoda generated using the Replicator Plus, you can really see the resolution difference between the 0.1 millimeter layer height and the 0.2 millimeter layer height. Again, this is something that is switch selectable, but you can really see the difference. You can also see some of the difference in how the ears are rendered. The ear test is particularly common in terms of how you want to torture test, because those ears hang out so much and you want to see how well the supports work and how well the ears render. And as you can see, there is a difference between the two of them. The eyes were kind of interesting when you go across from the Replicator 5th generation over and look at the eyes in the Replicator Plus. While the resolution is lower in the Replicator Plus, it is the features, Yoda's features, are much more pronounced than they were with the Replicator 5th generation. And then when we look at supports, one of the things that becomes really apparent is that the supports generated to hold up Yoda's chin and going around his mouth are much bigger and heavier in the Replicator 5th generation than they are in the new version of software on the Replicator Plus. So as you can see across these two machines, we're seeing quite a bit of a difference, but at the same time, nothing that is a game changer in terms of quality. And that's probably because we're using the same extruder, and although we have a bigger build volume and more robust gantry system, we're essentially using much of the same hardware that we were using before with some software tweaks. And again, hopefully we'll see more updates to the MakerBot print software that will give us a little bit more flexibility. So with that, let's wrap it up, and I'll tell you what I think overall. So as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot has changed in the 3D printing world in 2.5 years. MakerBot's had some interesting challenges. They've had some leadership changes, they've had some focus changes, they moved their manufacturing from New York City to offshore, and there have been some user problems with regard to the MakerBot 5th generation in terms of both the move from an open source model to a proprietary model, and also due to some performance issues, many of which were solved by the Smart Extruder Plus. So this brings us to an interesting question. Is the Replicator Plus too little, too late? Well, to answer that, we need to decide, does it serve a need and does it provide value? For business, the answer is definitely a yes. This is a business-oriented printer. This is not a hobbyist printer, and it shows in a lot of its capabilities. It's also got a much bigger build plate. It's one of the bigger build plate printers, especially for the price. So that becomes kind of interesting. And I think moving away from hobbyists is good because as MakerBot has worked on increasing its capabilities and reliability and the ability to provide telemetry back to the users and split among multiple machines, those are business needs and not hobbyist needs. And it's a kind of different focus from the folks who want to tinker with removing their hot end and trying a different kind of metal as a hot end and all those sorts of things. So what of the machine? What do we think of this machine, the Replicator Plus, versus the 5th generation? Well, as I said, a lot of it's similar because it's using the same frame. But having a more robust gantry and a more robust extruder is a really good thing. The benefit of increasing the build volume and making it easier to manage the build volume is great, but there are some substantial negatives. First, my biggest question is, will that build plate that flexes, will that build plate break with some too enthusiastic attempts to pull models off the plate? So are you going to have things like, students yanking at this thing to try to get a plate off, or business people pounding at it and having it snap? That's a question. I really don't know, but we'll see. My guess is that's probably not going to be too much of an issue because people don't want to break their 3D printer, so some care will be provided. The bigger question has to do with the rafting problem that I found with this printer, but that is clearly a software issue, and so I expect that to be fixed relatively quickly because the MakerBot desktop software provides really excellent rafts that you can adjust, and I think it's really the simple fact that you can't adjust all the parameters in the new MakerBot print that limits it, and I can't imagine that that's going to be something we're going to see in the long term. In the meantime, you can probably use Simplify 3D with the new Replicator Plus and create your own configurations for everything. Simplify 3D works with the Replicator 5th generation, and given that the 5th generation has basically the same software interface in its panel and the same extruder, there's a pretty good chance that Simplify 3D will also work with the Replicator Plus, although I haven't yet tested it. So what about the good? Well, we talked about the more robust gantry, we talked about the more robust extruder, we talked about the bigger build volume, but the thing is this is a $2,000 printer, this was a $2,500 printer. That's a lot of build area for a $2,000 printer. Yes, it's not $200 or $400 or $1,200, but that's a big build area. I mean, that's a really big build area for that amount. This slight speed increase is also a benefit. Automatic bed leveling is good as well. So the bottom line is, if you've got a 5th generation printer and you like it, you're probably not going to upgrade it and just replace it with this. But if you're adding a new printer or you're choosing a printer and you want a large build area and you want a robust environment, then this is probably the printer for you. It's a really good printer. It's got some issues because it's brand new, but I think in a couple of months, as more software updates come out, I think we're going to find that this is an excellent printer, especially for the capacity and the cost. Now, I want to once again shout out to the MakerBot people because they have made it possible for me to do the ZDNet DIY IT 3D printing discovery series. When I wanted to get started doing it, they sent me the Replicator and have let me play with it for pretty much a whole year. And now they've sent me this device. I'll be sending the Replicator 5th generation back, and you'll be seeing this in future videos as well and future articles. But I really want to thank them because they've been incredibly supportive of my ability to bring information to you folks and help you understand 3D printing. So special shout out to those guys. They've been awesome. And if you want to watch more of ZDNet's DIY IT 3D printing discovery series, there's a little subscribe button down there. And of course, visit the ZDNet DIY IT 3D printing discovery series page, which will take you through all of the articles I've done on 3D printing so far and those to come. So for ZDNet, and with a shout out of thanks to MakerBot, my name is David Gowertz. Go forth, build something, print something cool.